Hey everyone, this is the After Hours interview with Fernando and Robert. Thank you for joining us. A lot of you may come over from the Seeking Alpha interview, or if you haven't, go to Seeking Alpha and type in my name, Robert Keens, and you can find that interview with Fernando, where we talk about a lot of the financial and economic impacts of what's going on around the world and some of the geopolitical realignments and his experience in Argentina when he went through the currency crisis and the economic crash. And Fernando, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be talking here with you.
So I wanted to have this expanded interview because I think there's a lot of things that you and I could talk about that may not fit on other channels, but would be perfect here. And so, yeah, I definitely appreciate you doing this for us. It's really a big help to have someone who's lived through a crisis be able to explain exactly what went on. And certainly talking from like a prepper perspective, or just generally being prepared for whatever may happen. A lot of us really can only read books and read accounts, of what other people went through. But if we haven't experienced it for ourselves, we don't know what to do. So I think your experience is very valuable.
Well, it's great talking with you about these topics and always being reasonable and just things that make sense.
Sure. So you and I were speaking before the interview about your journey. So if you could just take a moment and explain to the listeners what happened in Argentina and more, in depth about what happened to you and how you reacted. And I think you also have a couple of books talking about this experience as well, if you want to talk about that, and we can, so that our listeners can get a copy of that.
Well, I grew up in Argentina. I did travel quite a bit because of my father. He was in banking. I lived in the United States. Think of it as the middle class, upper middle class in Argentina, a private bilingual school, that sort of thing. Nice neighborhood. So yeah, life was good. Still is very much so, thankfully. But in 2001, the country went through a very serious economic crisis and political crisis as well. It basically ended up collapsing overnight. There were signs, I guess, before, but the country was pretty much a mess for years after that. It still is. I ended up leaving Argentina a few years later. Trying to think about it right now. Was 2012 probably. So yeah, I left Argentina when I realized things were not going to be changing anytime soon. Finding better living conditions. I lived in Ireland, which I very much enjoyed, and currently I'm in Spain right now.
Okay. So what attracted you to Spain? I know you got out, you originally went to Ireland, and that was probably a really good experience, probably a completely different cultural experience for you. But what attracted you down to Spain?
Well, yeah. The thing is, having lived in the United States when I was little, I wanted my kids to also have that experience of, having that a good English, mostly, that experience of living over there. I also like the idea of living in Ireland. I like the country a lot, and it was great. The thing is that Ireland has a very peculiar weather, so as to put it somehow. Um, that's maybe one of the biggest drawbacks that it has. Spain is a great place as well. Um, Quite different culturally speaking, right? But it's a more lively lifestyle, so as to put it some way. Maybe the opposite in terms of weather, sunshine, um, uh, quality of life, and that sort of thing. So we wanted to do that too.
Okay, good. So I'm glad that you found, a place that you're comfortable with, and I know you have family there as well. So definitely glad to hear that you're out of the tough situation that you went through in Argentina. Can you describe a little bit about what happened in Argentina? I think we've already talked about the economics of it. There was a currency crisis and an economic crash. But can you talk more about what happened sort of around you and the preparations that you had to make to deal with the situation?
Well, the currency crashed in the Argentine peso crashed in December 2001 when the country defaulted on its national debt. People rushed to banks. The banks closed their doors, converted people's accounts from one third rate. Eventually, I mean, long story short, in a matter of days, you lost 66%, 70% of your savings or whatever money you had because of the new conversion rate. It was a social political collapse because the president resigned. There was a martial law was declared. In fact, there was rioting and looting on the streets, and looting lasted for weeks, months later after that. So it became very dangerous as well. The country eventually, as time went by, a very drastic change. It used to be that Argentina looked at countries like Colombia and the kidnapping and the violence over there and the drugs, and you would say that doesn't happen here. But eventually, that's exactly what you turn into.
So, from a personal protection standpoint, what were some of the issues that you had? And I mean, did you have to take self-defense? Did you have to buy different locks for your doors, or get weapons, or what happened there?
Well, eventually everyone started hardening their houses. Every single house, especially in our neighborhood, it was like a middle class, upper middle class mix of houses, and everyone had a fence, a 6-foot, iron fence, bars on their windows, reinforced doors, alarms. You never left your door open or window. You became very careful about those kind of things. Eventually, when kidnapping started happening, you never left your car door open either when driving. You were very careful about carjackings, which happened all day long. Personally, I've always been interested in shooting firearms, and I specialize a little bit more on self-defense since that. So I started taking self-defense shooting classes, and being armed, at least for me, was a big part of being safe.
Okay. And you mentioned a lot about taking those firearms courses and stuff. Were there other things that you did prepping-wise to prepare for what was going on around you? Like, for instance, food storage and access to money, and what else did you have to do?
Correct. You would always have savings. And when this went down at first, you were limited in the amount of cash you could withdraw from ATMs. I think the limit was like 300 pesos a week. Think of it as only being able to withdraw in cash about $100 a week. The rest of it, you had to find whoever accepted your debit card, which was not everyone. It was quite rare. What ended up happening was that everyone tried to find cash, and ATMs, they would run out of money very fast. So you wait in line, pick whatever cash you could. Then, as everything started degrading, lots of interesting things started happening. Blackouts, the quality of water went down, so it was important to have a good water filter as well, because all these little things you rarely think of started happening. I had a voltage elevator in my house. This is a gadget that stabilizes the electric current because it was not stable. It was always flickering. So all these little preparations, and yes, as well, food storage was important too.
So what types of foods do you recommend for long-term food storage? Because I think that's a big topic of conversation for people who think that there could be a time when food gets short. For example, my parents, as I was telling you before, grew up during the Great Depression. And my father went off to World War II to fight the Nazis. And during that time, before my mother and father met, my mother lived on a farm in Texas during the Great Depression. And the people that lived on the farm, they were able to grow their own goods. But even though they were able to grow them, sometimes they had a shortage of fertilizer, or if there was a drought, there wasn't always water, so even the people on the farms had a really hard time, but they were able to survive because they could grow their own food. And I think the people in the cities, it was much harder on them because they depended so much on the government, and without the government, they may starve. And so I was always taught growing up, there's a term that we use in Texas, it's called having a good pantry. Yeah. And basically what that means is keeping 6 months of food stored so that if something ever were to happen, you have, food that at your disposal to feed your family. And growing up in a family that had that background, we just always did those sorts of things without thinking about it, because so much of my family was in agriculture, we always had access to meat if we needed it in the form of pigs or cows, and we could grow our own corn and things. And so it was, we didn't really have to store it as much as we just sort of grew it, but we would store enough that, we could get through the winter or something like that. But from your perspective, if there's somebody living in the suburbs of the city and may not have access to those resources, what would they do, and what kind of foods would you pick, and how would you store them?
You store what you eat what you store, right?
Right.
You find that to be throwing money at the or whatever prepper rotating every 10 years or so. My advice is for example, for us, we eat a lot of rice with meat. One of our staples would be rice, and it's actually a quite good type of food to have a good amount of. Because for a very long time, it's usually quite affordable as well. There's different types of rice, and some are better than others, and it's quite interesting to learn that. Lentils as well are great food. It's considered a superfood because of its nutritional value. Lentils, at least here, are quite affordable and store very well.
Okay, and I think you have a lot of these tips in some of your books, so let's talk about that. I think you've written two that I see here on your website. You have Surviving the Economic Collapse and then Bugging Out and Relocating. Can you speak about each book and kind of tell us what they offer to people that are looking at what's going on in the economy and they're saying, okay, maybe I need to make some preparations and may not know how to get started?
Sure. My first book was The Modern Survival Manual, Surviving the Economic Collapse, which was based on those first years in Argentina when things got really tough, in all aspects of life, crime, violence, the instability, the prices going nuts all the time. It's mostly about that sort of urban survival thing in a post-economic collapse society. What I always was interested in wilderness survival as a kid, camping and that sort of stuff. I realized that when I bought books on urban survival, it was usually somewhat translated from that, and it wasn't valuable information. I ended up realizing that one of the things that I could find and read were helpful for my particular situation. So I started learning, writing along the way as I roll with it, basically. And my second book is divided in two parts, which is Bugging Out and Relocating. They're two separate things. Now, the first one is about bugging out is when you don't have much of an option but to leave. It's not a matter of choice, right? For example, what happened recently in California with the fires. People that never thought they would have to all of a sudden have 1 minute, 5 minutes, maybe an hour to leave before everything burns down. That's something people just cannot cope with. This idea is, have my retreat, I'm going to be making my last stand here, very much Texas-wise, with the famous, help me out here, the last stand, El Alamo style, right? They're going to make their last stand, whatever happens. Now, if there's a flood, you have to. If there's a fire, you have to leave. If there's war tearing your country apart, like in Ukraine, you don't have a choice either. Now, the second part is about relocating, which is making the strategical decision that I did of finding good places where you have the quality you want for yourself and your family, and making that move consciously so.
Okay. So in terms of bugging out, what do you recommend that people have ready? A lot of people talk about bug out bags and things like that. What do you use and what do you prepare with?
I have a small bag with a few essentials that I just would, if I have just 1 minute, I open the safe and that's where I get out. I have my documents there, my passport, the cash. There's a gun nearby as well. So those would be the things that I would recommend grabbing and taking with. That's something I addressed in the book specifically, having a USB drive with important documents, photographs as well. Today you have different digital tools that allow you to store photographs and documents online that's accessible as well. But it's always a good idea to have that in a solid format too. Um, yeah, and then plus, what I do if I have 1 minute, what I do if I have 5, 10, what I do if I have an hour or a couple of days to leave. It's not the same kind of gear. It's not the same kind of thing that you will be grabbing, because honestly, sometimes you have just 1 minute, 2 minutes. House fires, that's how fast they go down. And, and it's something that people just don't prepare for.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And so you can have different plans depending on what happens. Talking more about, let's say there's some sort of economic collapse and wherever you're living, let's say you live in the city, and it looks like it's going to get more dangerous and you have a family and you're trying to get out. What types of things would you have at hand in case that, because I think economic collapse is, you'll have a little bit more time maybe to prepare, maybe a few days or a couple of weeks.
Sure.
So what types of stuff would you have at hand, would you recommend people have at hand during that scenario to take with them?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why I separated the books. The second book, it's in very clearly in two parts: the bugging out one and the relocating one. When you have what you were just saying, an economic crisis or an economic collapse or a social downturn for whatever reason, because of immigration, because of political changes, that's more of the relocating aspect of making a cool-headed decision of, okay, what I want for my life, why I'm not having it here anymore, where can I find it? So you start looking. This is what I do myself when I pick a place for myself is, does this place offer? What's the crime like? What's the education like? What kind of health care does it have? What about unemployment? What about income? What kind of job opportunities do you have here? What does it have in terms of life quality that is being offered? So, even looking at natural disasters, is this a specific area that floods? I mean, when I lived in Ireland, I had actually looked back at maps 200 years ago of different floods, and I specifically chose a place that had never flooded. Wouldn't it happen that just a year later, when I was living there, there was this big storm, everything got flooded, but I was in the specific spot that never got flooded. It wasn't an accident; it was a conscious decision.
Wow, that's interesting. I never thought about that before. Going that deep into figuring out, natural disasters that could affect you. Because yeah, if you move somewhere, you don't want to be wiped out, right? You want to definitely make sure that you're planning for all different types of scenarios. It's not just about the house fire. It's not just about the economic collapse. You've also got natural disasters, like you said. You've got immigration potential concerns. So there's really a lot of things that you have to consider when you're choosing a place to relocate.
Yeah, it's actually something that you can study and you can learn from it. And the fires in California, it's not a really something that, if you knew about these sort of things, you knew where it was most likely to happen. Same in Oregon and other places, or floods or other natural disasters. Usually, if you do your research, you find that some places are far more likely, or Hurricane Alley in certain parts of central U.S. You prepare for all that, and you have contingency plans, or you make the conscious decision of maybe not picking that specific point because it's likely to suffer it.
Yeah, and I can relate to Tornado Alley because I live in Texas, and we're very much sort of at the bottom of that tornado alley, and we do get tornadoes ripping through every few years. A few years ago, there was one that went through downtown Fort Worth, and you would think being downtown, you'd be very safe because you have these tall buildings and everything, but the tornado literally just ripped apart these very tall, big corporate buildings, and so you really weren't safe even being in a big city. So I can definitely relate to that, and there are a lot of my neighbors that live around me that have tornado shelters that either they built or that they've had installed because it's such a very big threat. So you're right; it doesn't really matter where you live. There's going to be some sort of threat, and I guess it's determining what you're comfortable with and what you may have resources to deal with. So, for example, the flooding. If you feel like you have resources to deal with that sort of situation, versus something else, and you may have to make some choices about where you ultimately pick that you want to go to, right?
And then you have, of course, because it's not just about avoiding these kind of things. If you have kids, do you have a good school for them? Do you have good job opportunities? Do you have a good gym, health club, a shooting range? The kind of things you want to have for your own enjoyment. Do you have a good hospital nearby? It's crazy, but all these little things matter. Usually, what happens is that the further away you live from a hospital, the lower your life expectancy is, because the moment you're being rushed to a hospital, minutes count. Every minute you are away from it, your chances of surviving decrease considerably.
Yeah, that raises two really good points in my mind. When most people talk about bugging out or relocating, it's usually out into the hills of Colorado or something, But if you do that, you really have to be your own medical. You have to be your own medical support, because you may not be able to get to a really good hospital if something happens.
And it also depends on why you're leaving. It's not all the same. Maybe it's something that's more personal. Maybe you have you're quite a a house two blocks down the street, living with your family. Maybe that's something that works for specific fit. Not everything is rushing to the mountains and waiting for the aliens to everyone.
Right. So in terms of relocating, you've lived in several different areas. You started out in Argentina, then you went to Ireland, and now you're in Spain. So it seems like you have a lot of experience with different political systems. Do you consider the political system when you relocate in terms of, is it more freedom oriented, or is it more heavy-handed government, and does that matter to you at all?
Yeah, it matters, and like more like minded people, I always prefer to have the most amount of freedom. It's like a gun law. That's something that matters for me. Something that a lot of people don't know is that in UK there are parts where you can actually own guns and handguns and practice shooting, and that would be Northern Ireland, which is where I was when I was over there. So yeah, I do take that into consideration. Always, no place is ideal these days. There's always a pro and con to pretty much everything, but I do try to keep it in mind as well.
Yeah. Okay. So what other tips can you give our listeners for, well, maybe I'll phrase it this way. What do you see are the biggest risks that people may need to start thinking about making their own preparations for? Do you see a lot of political risk, like geopolitical risk with all the things that are going on between the different countries? Do you see it more being economic? Is it a blend of those things, or what are the risks that you're really focused on right now and preparing for?
I would strongly recommend to keep it very real as of what's likely to affect your life as of right now. I lost count of people that had more beans and bullets and guns than you could possibly think of, and they were 100 pounds overweight, and their greatest threat to their life was the next donut they were going to be eating.
Right.
So you have to be honest with yourself. You have to keep it real. You don't have to be, a bodybuilder or Mr. Universe or whatever, but you have to keep it leveled in terms of what you're doing, so as to not only increase your odds of survival, but increase your quality of life as well. So that would be one of the things I try to focus a lot, not only myself, but with my family. We try to stay healthy. Have our medical checks at least once a year. Stay on top of that. Also enjoy life, because that's basically what it's all about, right? If you're not being happy, then what's the point?
Yeah, that's a really good point. In terms of what you see going forward, what are things that you're going to be doing in your own preparations that maybe you haven't focused on? Like, are there areas that you focused a lot on the gear and a little bit on the financial part and some other things and self-defense and food? Or are there areas which you still have to work on in your own preparations that you feel like you'll?
There's something that you can do. There's always things to improve, and I get lazy like everyone else, and not keep up on things like I should. It's the most normal thing in the world. It's a good idea, talking financially, to stay agile. To be very flexible, to have different options. We were talking about before in terms of people losing their jobs. One of the things that destroyed people in Argentina, and still does today, and it happens to a lot of people. They lose their job, and it's like it's the end of the world. They have no know how to be flexible, how to improvise, how to roll with the punches. That's only something I try to stay on top and have different options, and be as flexible as I can be, and have different baskets so as to work with that. If it's not something I already have going on, at least have a project or an idea to develop eventually. In terms of food, that sort of stuff, I'm pretty well set. In terms of firearms and such, yeah, definitely more than I could possibly need. But for me, it's something that I enjoy. I like shooting, and I participate. I take in the international pistol shooting competition with practical shooting. It's something I enjoy doing. Yes, it's something that gives you an edge in terms of speed and accuracy, and you practice with your firearm, and that keeps you in shape in that regard. But it's 90% something that I enjoy, and 10% concern about a third world war or something like that, right?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Focus on what you can control. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's good to be aware of it, but you may not be able to control it. So if you just focus on what you can control and just be aware of what's going on around you, you're more likely to survive any given situation, rather than if you're thinking about all the bad stuff in the world, you could just shut down and not get active and not know where to begin, and maybe not be effective in getting prepared, right?
A lot. I mean, there's in my community, preppers, survivalists, it happens a lot of people that end up losing their families. They end up getting divorces. They don't talk with them. My son is a liberal. I'm not talking to him anymore. Are you crazy? I don't care if he's Mao communist and he comes with a red T-shirt and he's completely nuts. He's still gonna be my son. I'm gonna be having a relationship as best as I can with him. I'm not gonna be, cutting off a family member because of that sort of thing. But people get really into the negative things, and they just lose perspective. You have to enjoy life as it is now. And you know what? The more contact you have with your kids, the more you enjoy life with them, the more you talk with them, the less likely he's going to be showing up one day with a Che Guevara T-shirt to be talking nonsense.
Yeah, so, that's a good point. Be involved in your kids' lives, and if you're good parents, usually the kids grow up. I think the kids follow the parents, so usually the kids will grow up well if the parents are teaching them. But not only teaching them, but they're involved every day in their lives, and let them know that they're there to support them.
And sometimes, sometimes kids, especially when they're teenagers, they kind of they don't try, they actually challenge you, and maybe you do something and they do the exact opposite just to piss you off a little bit, or to see your reaction. And it's important to be mature and know how to work with that. If it's something that they're just doing just to, again, I read this about my kid is a liberal and I'm extremely upset about that. Well, maybe you should be more talkative and explain to me why you suddenly like this. I bet that 90% of the time it's just going to be something to trigger you or get your attention, and they're going to be growing out of it soon enough.
Sure. Okay, so last thing I wanted to talk to you about, you have a section on your website about survival skills. From your experience in Argentina, what are good survival skills to have? You mentioned, people may lose their jobs and all of a sudden they freeze up and they don't know what to do. In a practical sense, what type of skills maybe could you barter with, or could bring you a little bit of extra money, or you could trade for other things that you need? What are the types of things that people can work on?
Well, I'm not giving any advice that it's all that different from what most people that know what they're talking about would say. My advice would be for those things that you love, those things that you're passionate about, because if you're passionate about something, there's a good chance you're going to be doing it well enough to earn a living. And being resilient is also very important, the attitude as well. When I was just getting married, it was just after 2001, and Argentina had a real 25% unemployment rate. It wasn't the 30% unemployment rate in Spain, where 29% of those are actually working on the side and taking money from the. It was an honest to God 25% unemployment rate, and the lines for each and every job went around the block. There were hundreds of people for every job position for real. And even in that situation, I had in my first week of looking for a job, I had 2 job offers. And one of them told me that what she liked the most was my attitude, because she asked me about something that I didn't know, and I just told her, you know what? Don't worry about it, because this is something I'm gonna be figuring it out. I'm gonna be learning how to do it and doing it well. And saying that alone got me that job. If I wanted it, it was there for me.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Keep a positive attitude no matter what happens. I think that applies to a lot of situations in life, not just survival situations. I think even in normal times, that's good advice.
Yeah, it's for example, a lot of the older folks after 2001, the guys that had been in management for maybe 10, 20 years, all of a sudden they got fired. They just didn't know what to do with their life. They had no idea of starting their own business or doing something else, changing at that stage in their life. It was for them. It was. I mean, lots of people committed suicide over this sort of thing. They just could not deal with it.
Okay, Fernando, this has been a very good conversation. I really do appreciate you coming on the channel and providing all of your wisdom. Tell us how people can find your channel on YouTube if they want to learn more about your experiences and what you're talking about.
Sure. My YouTube channel is The Modern Survivalist, and my website is themodernsurvivalist.com as well.
Okay. And do you have a newsletter or anything, or do you primarily communicate through YouTube?
YouTube and my website would be the ones that I use the most, yes.
Okay. Anything that we left out that you want to talk about for just a moment?
I think we covered pretty much everything, right?
Yeah, we did. We had 2 really great interviews. And again, I wanted to thank you so much. I appreciate your knowledge in the area and your willingness to share. Certainly, I'm from Texas, and we've never met each other face to face, but I appreciate your willingness to come on and chat with me and help people that are in a far off distant place. I think it takes a special person to want to do that, and I definitely do appreciate the time that you provided.
Hey, thanks a lot, and I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Okay, thank you so much, and we'll chat with you later.